There's a recent Pew Global Attitude Survey came out last week or week before that found 70% of the respondents identified environmental problems as a major issue. When you go through the country-by-country breakdown of the data from that survey, you see huge jumps in awareness about environmental issues and the importance of climate change in particular between 2002 and 2007. Interestingly, some of the biggest increases in awareness are in small island states, developing countries, Africa, and Asia. So with this kind of unprecedented public awareness, you would think that we're on track to solving the problem. In fact, I think what this poll also shows is that there's a major disconnect between what we think is important and what governments think is important. And for those of us, to use a Canadian example, or going back to the comment earlier about we don't always focus on Ontario, we had an election here this week, and hands up if you remember anybody talking about the environment, public housing, transportation, impact on cities, funding formulas, all that kind of stuff. It wasn't there. We were talking about other things. It was like the issues that were being discussed around the dining tables of Ontario were not in the media. I think that our awareness that there is an environmental emergency and a spiritual moral crisis looming, happening, as Al Gore put it, is not shared by governments that live in certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, 4-year re-election cycles. And I'd like to illustrate this point and the problem it raises, not because I'm terribly cynical and I think you should give up on international processes. In fact, what I'm going to do is urge you to somehow think through this weekend, how do we as a community influence these processes? Where are the levers? How do you make a difference on that level? Because I think individual action is important, but isolated individual action is not going to be enough. What we need is concerted action on the international level. I think the best illustration of what works and what doesn't work with these processes is the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, which was released in 2004. Some of the data which was used in the recent report of the IPCC. The ACIA was sponsored by the Arctic Council, which is a body of 8 Arctic nations, including Canada, the US, Russia, Iceland, the Nordic countries, and I'm probably missing somebody in there. It's also made up of 6 Indigenous peoples organizations. And the secretariat that I worked for before is part of the support for those Indigenous peoples organizations. The assessment, the Arctic assessment, was important for a couple of reasons. One, it was the first regional climate assessment, and it was also the first assessment that I'm aware of that brought in Indigenous knowledge. And so the Indigenous peoples worked with the scientists and researchers in putting this assessment together. And its findings and observations, if 3 years ago you could talk about the Arctic till you were blue in the face, and you weren't going to get any media attention, you weren't going to really have anybody pay attention, they were going to think, oh well, it's somewhere up there. Something has happened in that 3-year period. One of the things that's happened is this assessment and how that information got out into the public and the work that Indigenous peoples did to advocate on behalf of the Arctic. The assessment showed clearly that the rate of climate change, as you've heard, is twice the rate of that of the rest of the world, and that the major effect of emissions in the south are being felt in the north. So you would think that this is pretty astounding stuff, that everybody should get together and have very little difficulty in putting forward a strong statement, calling for strong global action right now. There was a policy document released at the same time as the scientific work in the fall of 2004. My guess is nobody in this room has heard of it or seen it. And so you won't be able to recall the fact that it did not have a ringing declaration in it. This is the political document produced by the 8 Arctic states. There was no mention in this document of the Kyoto Protocol. There was no mention there was no mention of emissions targets to reduce greenhouse gas levels. How do you keep them from going up to 450? It was all very softened, I guess is the way to describe it. The Indigenous peoples organizations who've been involved in this work, of course, were pushing for very strong declarations. They wanted a link between the climate impact assessment and the global negotiations. The UN, United Nations Environment Program Governing Council had just, and this is a body of 185 countries from around the world, hard to get a consensus in that group. They had come to a consensus that the Arctic is an important indicator region of global environmental health. So you would think that that would be reflected in the document. None of it was. And the reason for that is because the United States didn't want it to be there. The United States decided at this time that the less said about this assessment, the better. And that's ironic considering the United States paid for almost all of the scientific work. They had the Secretariat in Alaska, and but there was a real difference between that level and the political level, and I won't get into that. The State Department was under direction from the White House to discredit the science, so they put an army of people to work picking apart the science, and when they found they couldn't do that, they decided they would switch tactics and introduce their own version of a policy document. And they didn't get their way in the end because they had to negotiate this with 7 other countries. They didn't get their way. Something else came forward, but because it was a consensus document, it was very weak, and there was a lot of compromise and little substance. And it should be said that the Nordic countries, especially Sweden, were very, very strong on the same side as the indigenous peoples, pushing for a strong statement about the need to cut emissions. And it was felt that, well, there was some discussion, but let's just leave the United States out. Other countries said, no, you can't do that. So it went back and forth for weeks. And so in the end, we got not very much at all, and it vanished off the radar screen. I think what this shows is that these processes are easy to derail, but it's not an argument against global action. In fact, I would argue in the Arctic, if you didn't have something like the Arctic Council to bring forward these issues, and the Council's been responsible for supporting some very important scientific work that's happened in the area of contaminants, a lot of the Arctic data on contaminants and the impact of transboundary pollutants found its way into the negotiating process for what's now the Stockholm POPs Treaty, which is in the process of banning 12 of the most dangerous chemicals that we know, man-made chemicals. And so its work is important. It's just that when it hits this political rock, things don't go forward very well. I think that this is an important thing to keep in mind when we look ahead at the next Framework Convention negotiations, which will take place in Bali this fall. This is a very important meeting, and we've had a reference to the Secretary General also saying the same thing. What Ban Ki-moon has said is that Bali must advance a negotiating agenda to combat climate change on all fronts, including adaptation, mitigation, clean technologies, deforestation, resource mobilization. Bali must be the political response to the scientific reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. All countries must do what they can to reach an agreement by 2009 and to have it enforced by the expiry of the current Kyoto Protocol commitment, which is coming in 2012. It's going to be an uphill struggle, of course, because in fact, U.S. policy really hasn't changed, and there have been some shifts in alliances in this rarefied negotiating world that don't necessarily bode well. One of them, George Bush got up and managed to say climate change without rolling his eyes recently, and we were all thankful for that. It's good that George has discovered that climate change is a problem. But he's not talking about the kinds of mandatory cuts that we need to make to avoid dangerous climate change. And neither is Australia, and neither, quite frankly, is Canada. And I think for the wealthy, industrialized countries, and this is getting back to one of the points that we're trying to make in this program, for the wealthy, industrialized countries to say, we're going to do a lot of stuff, but we're really just going to keep emitting at current rates or with less intensity than we are, whatever that means, is immoral. And it's an increasingly untenable position. So one of the things that's going to happen in Bali is there are going to be clear lines drawn between countries that are on, you're either for these deep cuts or against. I mean, this is part of an ongoing discussion. But the important thing in this meeting is to find a way around the impasse